Welcome back to another episode of the Converge podcast, where we help you have a Christian worldview in a post-Christian culture. My name is Steve.
My name is Nate.
And we are both pastors at Village Church. And today we want to talk a little bit more about really something that happened a little over a week ago. As of the recording of this, there's a possible coup going on with President Biden. We're not sure if he's even alive at this point. We don't know who's running the country. But a little over a week ago, there was an attempt on President Trump's life. And the day after that attempt, I basically had an introduction to my sermon that Sunday, talking about the political division that takes place in our country. And then the day or 2 days subsequent to that, I also released an article with the Center for Baptist Leadership, kind of going more in detail as to what I was talking about. And we really just wanted to have a podcast about what is it that we mean that when we say we cannot have unity with the left. What is it that we mean when we say the right must win? And of course, this is an environment where we can kind of go into more detail on that, maybe seek a little bit more understanding, unpack it a little bit more for people what we mean by that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different directions you can go with all that. So hopefully we'll get somewhere as we walk through this. But I do think it's helpful just to talk through some of these issues a little bit more, give some more context. A lot of this is in your article, so if folks want to read that, I think it's super helpful. But if you haven't, I think this podcast will also help. An event like the assassination of a president, right? When that happens, instantly, most pastors, I think, have a thought of, should I talk about this or not? Is it something that people are wondering about, people are thinking about? Do I need to talk about it? And we have been of the opinion in the past, pastors should not feel any obligation to address any and every cultural issue that happens, and we don't always. But there are some events that are so on the mind of people and so important to really how they're going to live out their day-to-day lives in the coming weeks and months, that there is some pastoral wisdom in shepherding that.
Yeah, I think maybe when we were first starting the church, around 2008, 2009, we started the church in 2009. I think that we were of the opinion that, you got to choose politics or Christ. You shouldn't, in a sense, lead your church into the political arena. You almost need to be Switzerland about political issues. And I think a couple of things have happened since then that have necessarily certainly changed my opinion. I know changed your opinion. And even just as a pastoral team with the 6 pastors at Village Church, we're very united on this. And so I think it's very safe to say that you and I in this avenue, we're speaking for all 6 of the pastors at Village Church. And there's been almost an evolution that has taken place since then. And it started in 2016 with a lot of the division that was going on because of issues with critical race theory, accusations of police brutality that were untrue at that point. But really, from 2020 onward, the makeup of culture in the United States has shifted to a point where it forced us to really reckon with the fact that it isn't politics or Christ, because Christ necessarily is Lord over politics. Therefore, with the unrest, the division, the clear distinction between what I would call wickedness and righteousness that takes place in our nation right now, and really the questions that Christians have, and specifically church members have, what do I do? How do I react? Even how do I vote? There is no way that we can bury our head in the sand. There's no way that we can pretend there aren't great ramifications for the people in our church and beyond that are necessarily taking place at this point. And so I do think that while many would just kind of like stay in your lane, I think politics necessarily is the lane that pastors, especially now, regardless of what has taken place in the past, pastors must wade into those waters, and pastors must feel an obligation to help their people think through these issues. And when you see an event like took place on July 13th, which is going to be a day that's in history books, as I said a few Sundays ago, there are not many assassination attempts on presidents. And this specific assassination attempt, I think, was very timely in a sense, because it really does represent the division that takes place. And the division that takes place, in my opinion, is healthy. And so from my perspective, as soon as the assassination attempt took place, and of course we're friends with many pastors, we're personal friends with many pastors, but on social media, we follow a lot of pastors follow us. And as soon as the assassination attempt took place, what I saw was this almost groupthink standard that took place on social media, where everyone, where the quote unquote experts to all the way down to pastors that we personally know, everyone was saying that the following day needed to be a call and a prayer for peace and unity in our nation. And this blanket call for unity assumes that there's common ground to be found on both sides. And my thought behind what I said was, I think that's a foolish thing. I don't think that we can put a call for unity out right now. I think what is actually needed right now is for pastors to be honest about the good division that's taking place in our country right now.
When something like that event happens, and the immediate reaction of most of the experts in evangelicalism is to say, oh, we need to pray for unity. There's so much chaos and division in the country. We've got to pray that we come together and heal. You have to realize it's a little bit of a tell, because they're acknowledging there's so much division in the country. They see it too.
Yeah.
They never talk about it, but they see it. And so then your response is, okay, well, yes, in a Christian sense, in a vacuum, we always pray for unity and peace and healing. But what is really happening here that everyone sees so clearly that we need to address? And that actually is the division.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really appreciated that from you on that Sunday morning. But yeah, that's the thing. Like, all our people in the pews, they know that unity and peace is good. What they don't know what to do about is this division that they see, and how do they process that? And that's pastorally what we actually need to help them think through theologically.
Yeah, there's two options. The first one is the one that I think, at least from what I saw, was what the majority of evangelical pastors, the majority of people that I know did, which was just make a blanket call for peace and unity in our nation.
I heard a lot of both sidesing even.
Oh yeah. There's evil people on both sides. There's good people on both sides. You can do that. The reason that I chose the other path, which the other path is that I think it's time to speak openly and frankly about the division in our country, to identify what evil is. These calls for unity, I think, boil down to nothing more than this kind of milquetoast call for unity by which we cover the reality of division and almost kind of sweep it under the rug, pretending it doesn't exist, so that we won't have to have hard conversations, so that we won't have to say, hey, these are the issues that are really going on. Because I think a lot of pastors feel ill-equipped to talk about politics, because it is very complex. It is very complicated, not because we can't understand it, but just because there's so much going on. There are so many talking heads in everybody's ears, and a lot of pastors don't know what to do, so they just say unity.
We have often said, I think one of the verses for our time is Jeremiah 6:14. I don't even have it here, but peace, peace, where there is no peace. That's repeated a few other times in different ways by other prophets. And I think that's so true. Like, God clearly, through the prophet, says, don't say there's peace when there isn't.
Yeah, I think any speech that claims that there's good on both sides is lying. It just lies about the true nature of what's going on. A couple weeks ago, this was before the assassination attempt, Matt Chandler, who has really devolved, not just in his influence, but I think in his thought process and his helpfulness. I think he's wholly unhelpful now. He quotes two quote unquote theologians, N.T. Wright and Michael Bird, who are both unhelpful. I don't think either of those have anything to add to anybody where culture is concerned, saying that, the left wants the kingdom without the king, the right wants the king without the kingdom, and that's just gobbledygook. That doesn't even make sense. The left does not want the kingdom. The left wants destruction. And so this is not a time for us to have this doublespeak. This is not a time for you to just give in to the groupthink. I don't care what your denominational leaders are saying. It doesn't matter what network heads are saying, what the people that you've based your church plant philosophy on, whether or not you're a church growth movement guy, whether or not you're a reformed guy, whether or not you're a house church guy. Now is the time to just be honest. And I think this is just also not a time to kind of give some type of platitude. That's nothing more than toxic pietism. I heard earlier today somebody resort to using the language of, hey, brothers, don't forget that this world is not our home. I think that's an untrue statement, and I also think it's an unhelpful statement, and I think it's a cowardly statement. Where that comes from is the book of Philippians, where the book of Philippians says your citizenship is in heaven. But that text is not some kind of Gnostic denial of physical reality. We are, by Jesus, as I stated in the article, we're called in Matthew 5 to be salt and light, simply because our citizenship is in heaven. And what Paul's point is that your citizenship being in heaven has a direct impact in how you steward, how you invest in this world, and how you are salt and light in this present world. And so we have to teach people how to engage in a tumultuous time where evil people are seeking to do Christians harm, but more than that, evil people are seeking to do great cultural harm, and the only barrier between evil people and normal everyday people is the church. And so we have to prepare the church of Jesus Christ to fight.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is pastors just not wanting to live in reality. You look at that division, and this is what happened when you see it. I think it's important to say it's not just merely the assassination attempt that we're reacting to. It's all that it brings up. It's all that it reveals. Is we've got the left in this country, and then we'll talk about it, but they have a litany of ways in which they seek to destroy the country. There is an opposing side to that seeking to stop that. It is not perfect, and we're going to talk about that too a little bit. But the reality is one of those two sides is going to win. And so it's not even enough to just say, yes, division is real, there's good and there's bad. What should Christians do about it? We should seek to defeat evil. And I think to ignore that, and that is where so many pastors don't want to go. Most wouldn't even do this. Most just have a blanket call to unity. Both sides have terrible things. We need to have less division. A few did go so far as to say, there's a righteousness here and an evil, and we need to pray for righteousness. But most don't want to go to that next step, which is obviously true. That means the left must be defeated.
Yeah.
And I think if we won't say that, we're not being real and honest with our people.
Yeah, I think what my assumption is that took place that morning is that a lot of church staffs, a lot of pastoral teams got together. And I honestly think they just wanted to get through it.
Yeah,
I think they had a sacrificial lamb, whether it was the preaching pastor or whether it was the guy doing the announcements who just gave a token prayer. They got together that morning and they were like, hey, can we ignore this? And they probably agreed, no, we can't ignore this. Well, let's just do the minimum. Let's just get through this. And if we can just get through this, we can just get back to business as usual. And most pastors think business as usual is totally ignoring the outside world, teaching their people to be just pious, spiritual, discipline-oriented, praying the valley of vision every day, and just ignoring the world outside. Bury your head in the sand, do sound exegesis and hermeneutics. Here's an expository sermon where I ignore any life application and I just talk about how good the gospel is. Meanwhile, the world around us is devolving, and we have to understand that if that's going to be our kind of strategy moving forward, we are not the salt and the light. We're not preserving culture. We're not impacting society. We're not engaging the culture. And the experts that you found helpful from 2005 to 2014 cannot be trusted anymore. They are completely disarmed, and none of their advice and none of their influence is helpful at all. I can tell you, all of the denominational employees, all of the denominational leaders that I know that try to have an influence in people's lives, they are completely ill-equipped for the cultural moment that we find ourselves in. So pastors either have to draw lines of division or ignore reality. But either way, what you're going to see happen is when 18-year-olds leave your church and go to college, the number of them deconstructing is going to get even greater because you did not equip them to have any type of barrier between them and godless ideology. And it's going to be more political in the days ahead. It's not going to be less political in the days ahead. Most pastors in America are going to choose to ignore reality because they want to be seen as the nicest guys in the room. And your token notion that's just like, hey, brother, in a tumultuous time, if you want to have peace, just remember, Jesus is perfect peace in every storm. The key is nothing I said there is untrue.
Right.
He is perfect peace in the midst of storm, but him being peace in the midst of storm does not mean you ignore the storm. It does not mean that you are not engaging the battle, because what you're actually saying in that is a Gnostic platitude that is unhelpful, and it's going to lead to people being unequipped to reaching their neighbors with the gospel of Jesus Christ.
The reality is that approach is just not going to work anymore in a hyper-polarized age. It's a doomed project to try to not offend anyone, because if you successfully don't offend anyone, you will not say anything worth saying to the people who are looking to you for leadership. And that's how you end up with all these 18-year-olds headed off looking elsewhere, because the church did not have answers to what they can see. Just so people know.
Yeah.
Our kids, the older kids, they understand the world is crazy. They need leaders who are willing to say, yeah, it is, and here's the biblical answers to that.
Yeah, it's interesting because we put that clip out there and it got, almost 200,000 views, and then I put the article out there and that was read by many people. And so a lot of people, well-meaning people within the church and outside of the church, like, boy, I bet you've gotten some pushback, in the past couple of weeks. And it's true. I've gotten pushback. Most of the negative pushback is from people that I've never met before, so it doesn't really bother me at all because I don't know who they are. They don't know who I am. And even if they do know who I am, I can handle my own business. But my question to so many people is, yeah, I'm receiving pushback. But the key is I have the peace of Christ. Therefore, pushback. My question is, what are you doing with the peace of Christ that you have? Why isn't everyone getting pushback? Why do we only look to one or two leaders and say, "Whew, buddy, I bet you're enduring some pushback right now"? My question to everybody is, it's true, I'm getting some pushback. I'm fine with pushback. It's what I'm conditioned for. But my question to everybody is, why aren't you? Yeah. Why aren't you saying anything? Why aren't you engaging the darkness in this world?
So, when we're confronted with evil all around us, do we pray for fake unity, or do we challenge and encourage people that you need to see the world clearly and we can respond to resisting that evil? Obviously, we're in that latter camp. Like, we think we need to encourage that, yeah, evil's out there, but the church can do something about it.
Yeah, a lot of pastors do whatever they can to make leftists feel comfortable in their congregation, and you're going to make them feel comfortable all the way to hell. Yeah, that's a losing strategy. Yeah. The key is, I want anyone who is godless to be uncomfortable. Not just in our congregation. I want them to be uncomfortable in my presence, because they know that I'm coming with a culture engaging gospel that has absolutely zero fear of the repercussions that I will necessarily feel for engaging unbelief. And so when we do this token unity where it's just like, I just want everybody to feel comfortable in my presence. I don't want anyone to think I'm not a nice guy. We need to get over this idea that kind and nice are synonyms. Niceness can be the most hateful thing in the world if that niceness condemns someone to hell for all eternity. If that niceness serves as an avenue by which you obfuscate the gospel of Jesus Christ. You must be willing not just to engage on these issues, but be willing to really grow in your understanding of the issues that are really going on in culture right now. Because when we were being equipped to plant churches, I understood that I had an obligation to understand what was going on, not just in the souls of people where their hurt was concerned, but in society at large. I needed to understand those things so that I could better talk to people about the gospel, and so that I could better understand the evil that people are dealing with, so that I could shine light on darkness. But right now, what people are doing is they're letting darkness invade, and they think that the strategy is Wait until the last possible minute to shine any light on that darkness so that you don't scare the darkness away. And that's a losing strategy every single time.
It is one of the results of polarization. And when I say that, I just mean, and you can see this on any sociological chart you look at, the difference between, and I don't have better terms for this, so left and right in America is expanding greatly. And you can see this in charts that you look at. And so that's increased polarization. But what that means is, if you don't say anything that's going to offend anyone, you're saying less and less and less these days. So anytime you speak any truth of any kind, you're going to offend more and more people than you ever would have before. That's the reality of polarization. And a lot of what we're talking about here is, are you embracing as a pastor just the reality of that change and just diving headlong into, okay, but I'm still going to proclaim the truth? That's what's changed in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And so just a couple thoughts along those lines. And it does make me think about what are some old ways people used to think through these things, right? It's not 2004 anymore. It's 2024. A lot has changed. One is this idea that there are partisan political battles between right and left, and the church doesn't need to get involved in those things because there's not a clearly identified right or wrong. That's just an old notion that is not really out there in the culture anymore. Partisan battles are so clearly coded as either evil or good. Now, it does not mean that we're whitewashing, the right, that there's not such a thing as Christless conservatism, which there is. But on so many issues, there's a stark difference that if you are committed to not being partisan, you're just going to end up whitewashing evil. And so we've got to avoid that. There is good and there is evil. And I think this has been a theme of our podcast the last few years. So I don't think this is going to surprise anyone, but there's such a thing as a culture war, a culture battle. And you're going to have to pick a side. And not picking a side is to pick a side.
If we don't pick a side, then once the necessary fruit of the destruction that that we're always clear, but the destruction that the left is wreaking in society, once people understand what that destruction actually looks like, if we're unwilling to label it, if we're unwilling to name it, they're not going to know where to go to find safe harbor.
Right.
The only way that we can provide safe harbor, the only way that we can be effective where evangelism is concerned, is if we are 100% clear, 100% honesty. We live in an era where the only strategy for evangelism is one of clarity, is one of honesty, is one of transparency. And so I think for a long time, pastors and experts trained people to say, okay, you obfuscate sanctification until you get them to justification. And so once they come to faith in Jesus Christ, then you can slowly begin to tell them all of the things they've got to stop doing, all of the things they've got to stop believing. And it's this mentality that, if you just bring them to Jesus, everything else will just fall into place. And what we've actually seen is that people were claiming to believe the gospel, not understanding what the gospel was. And then it was like Jesus's parable, where it was the seed that shot up really quick, where once they found out the truth of what they were going to have to endure for Jesus Christ, they walked away. Because of the impact of postmodernism, I think Francis Schaeffer had it right. There's a lot of pre-evangelism that has to take place, and a lot of that pre-evangelism, what Francis Schaeffer said, is that you have to convince people that truth exists.
Yeah.
It's not just convincing people that there is a God, and that God hates sin, and through that loves you to the extent that he gave his only son. That's not sufficient in a postmodern era, because they can still come to it and say, well, we're not talking about objective sin. We're not talking about objective wrath and all of this. What you have to do is you have to first start with, hey, there's truth. And a lot of times that conversation begins in the concept of morality, is that before someone can even understand what sin is, they have to understand what right and wrong is. They have to understand what morality is. They have to understand there's an objective nature from a God who's actually given us a law by which we can know what right and wrong are. And that's what Francis Schaeffer calls pre-evangelism. And I think that is what so many from 2004 would have said, no, you can't do that, because you're just going to love them to Jesus and then magically fix it all. That was a failed experiment. That third way mentality, where you don't have to pick a side, you don't have to expose darkness, it was failed. It did not work. And the reason that so many are deconstructing, quote unquote, right now is not because people are being too upfront. It's because for a long period, almost an entire generation, people were not upfront at all.
So many of those deconstruction stories, you look at them, and the ideas that these poor people got from their churches are ridiculous and untrue. And it's like, yeah, if I had thought that was Christianity, maybe I would have deconstructed too. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, we're desperately in need of better political theology in the church.
When I hear you and us talking about, okay, we've got to pick a side, I know a lot of people cringe and are like, what are they going to talk about? And I think a lot of that is because we've had such a poor political theology in the church that conflates politics with morality. And our Christian morality should inform every bit of where we land on politics, but these are not the same things. And so politics is not just a matter of picking the most righteous leader. I wish all our leaders were evangelical Christians who are committed to a Christian worldview and all that. But that's not politics, because that's not the real world. Politics is about governing. And in order to govern, often you have to make co-belligerency with people who are not Christians. Christians have been dealing with this since the beginning of the faith. And so when we talk about the need to have a better political theology, we have to think about our political alignments and how are we going to do the most good, to love our neighbors the most, to have the most impact with our right Christian morality in the real world of what is facing us on the ground today at our current time. And so those are the things we have to start talking about. And then you start to think about political alignments. And is it true, and this is where you go in your article and where we end up at church, it is absolutely true that we need to be politically aligned right now with the right in order to push back against the civilizational ending nature of the left in order to provide a space for the propagation of the gospel.
Yeah, because what I think a lot of people miss is political activism, which is what we're talking about, is less about the specific leaders and more about the ideologies behind those leaders. Yeah. And so there's so many examples of this from the article that I wrote, but glib people just don't understand or want to acknowledge the fact that when we're talking about political ideology on the left and the right, we are talking about this Isaiah 5:20 reality where the prophet looks from the voice of God and says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And so if we apply that to our modern day culture, that only applies to the left. The left is the only ideological force in the United States that is currently aggressively, proactively, and intentionally seeking to get people to call evil good and good evil. Because the left, with their ideology, they want to destroy everything. They want to destroy families at every level of what God says a family is. They want to destroy the nuclear family, specifically nuclear families that look like me and you, because they want to say we're simply evil because of our whiteness, because of the fact that we have heterosexual marriages and are monogamous within them, because of the fact that we believe in having multiple children so that we can leave a legacy to this world, because of the fact that we would say, biblically speaking, that sphere is one by which we are sovereign over and our children belong to us. Our children do not belong to the state. We have to understand the left is completely anti-life. They want to kill babies in the womb. They want taxpayers to pay for killing babies in the womb. They want to be able to kill and abort children at every stage of development within the womb. And, you know, one of the things that was pointed out from the debate a few weeks ago is, and we had him as a governor, Ralph Northam even broached the subject of infanticide after the child has already been born, unwilling to ascribe rights to a baby. And what they'll say is simply because that child cannot take care of him or herself doesn't count as a human life yet. You do not get there from righteousness. You just simply don't.
Yeah. The left actively pushes perversion on children as something that they are trying to do in terms of grooming in the schools, grooming in the culture, media, on and on and on. And we do need to note in all of these things, there's a big difference between allowing them, which a lot of the Christless right is advocating for, and that's not good. But there's a big difference between allowing things and actively pushing them and advocating for them. There's no equivalency in those things right now. The left has a lot of policies that seek economic destruction. I mean, that is reality. Cultural Marxism, DEI, ripping apart the country in so many ways. Yeah, we could go on and on, but I just think some of these are good to highlight.
One of the funny things about DEI, it's not funny because of how wicked it is, but we just saw an assassination attempt. And that assassination attempt came directly after the leader of the Secret Service, who happens to be a woman because of DEI, she made the statement that she was going to use the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in order to raise the Secret Service to 30% female. And what we saw from that is a former president of the United States, a candidate for the presidency in this coming year, had someone trying to shield his body who was a full foot shorter than he was. That's the greatest picture of diversity, equity, and inclusion I've ever seen. If you're not as tall as the person, you cannot form a human shield around the person, no matter how foolish you want to be from your standpoint of epistemology.
Yeah, these policies are destructive, and there's no way to try to reconcile them as, maybe that's a viable alternative for a Christian. Young families cannot afford to form right now because of housing costs, and that's a big deal that needs to be addressed. Schools are being actively corrupted. The left is completely against school choice, and they would keep all families from homeschooling and even, I think, attending Christian schools if they got the opportunity. That should be noted. The left is hostile to Christianity. They would persecute the church if given the chance. We saw that from COVID. We saw that in the way that abortion protesters have been politically persecuted. We see that in the willingness to take kids from parents for not bowing down to the LGBT agenda. The left has made moves recently to make parts of the Bible hate speech. So we could go on and on and on. What needs to be acknowledged is it is not the same world that we lived in, even in 2005, certainly decades before that. We have to acknowledge that things have changed, and polarization means that we've got to choose a side right now because the furtherance of our civilization depends on it. And that's not a joke. Too many pastors are glib about that.
To deny any of this is to postmodernize the faith.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of pastors and Christian leaders just simply aren't educated enough to understand that that's what's happening to them. They're ignorant of the philosophy behind this. And they think that it is such a nice and kitschy thing to say, hey, Jesus is neither a Democrat nor a Republican. What you're doing right there is you're actually obfuscating and pretending that reality doesn't exist. You're pretending that there is no vast chasm between left and right. And even in just the short list that you just gave, there's an obvious chasm.
And we were given a Christian country. That is our inheritance, right? And so there was a time not long ago, but certainly for many years before that, where whatever political division in the country was victorious, we would still be free to proclaim the gospel, to worship as we need to worship, to raise our kids as we need to raise our kids. That's not true anymore. Pastors have got to recognize reality. If the left succeeds at what they intend to do, we will not be free to worship any longer.
Right.
That's worth us getting involved in. So that's polarization. How do we respond with a Christian worldview to that level of polarization?
Well, I think a lot of people have to understand that we actually have an obligation here. Yeah. We can. This is not just an opt-in or opt-out thing. We're just like a couple of us get in the fray and we sit out. I can be honest with you that if your pastor is not engaging in ideological warfare or culture warring right now, he is not equipping you where discipleship is concerned in an all of life mindset, and you have to have it. 1 Timothy 2, 1-4 says this, "First of all then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good. It is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires for all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth." And so we obviously have a pastoral obligation to tell our people the best way to pursue that vision, especially when it's glaringly obvious. And so the minimum standard that most people point out in verses 1 through 4 is that we have an obligation to pray for the president. And that's the long and the short of it. That's what they talk about, is that they want you to pray for him, but they ignore everything around that there's actually a direction by which you're praying. You're not just praying for him as an individual. Your prayers for the king, quote unquote, or the leader or the governmental authorities over you, are focused on what they can provide for you as a follower of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, the verse said it really plainly, and I just think we ignore this too much. Like, we are to seek a peaceful and quiet life in a government that would enable that. And if you think back about that list of things I talked about with the left, is that a peaceful and quiet life?
Mm-mm.
Absolutely not. Do we think that we will have an opportunity, if the right is victorious in this civilizational struggle that we are in, and that's what it is, that we will have an opportunity to advocate for a peaceful and quiet life? I do think that, and I have every reason, I think, to think
Absolutely.
that.
And the text isn't, so in verse 3, when it says this is good and is pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, so many just say, oh, it's good to pray for the leader. That's not what it says.
Yeah.
What it says is it's good to have a quiet and peaceable life, a godly, dignified life in every way. That's what is good, and that's the ends for which you are spiritually seeking through prayer that equips you to form that type of life, but also fight for that type of life. And so what is it that we're fighting for?
We're fighting for the freedom to worship and evangelize. And that's in the Timothy text too. It says, what's the purpose? Because God desires that all people would come to the knowledge of truth. We want the freedom to spread that truth. This idea that, and it is a sick idea, honestly, that the church is somehow better off under persecution, has no basis. It is true that the church will survive persecution and God will use persecution and the church cannot be defeated. That's all true. But in the history of the world, the church has flourished where freedom has flourished.
Yeah, I've had so many people in the past, 15, 20 years tell me, hey, you know what I think will be good is if the church endured a little bit of persecution. It's like, I don't think you actually know what you're saying.
No.
The scriptures say it's going to happen, but the scripture never says seek for that to happen. What we just read is actually the opposite of that, is that we're supposed to pray that we actually have the opportunity to not be persecuted. We actually have the opportunity to engage the culture around us freely, completely, that we have the ability to live these lives, to build families, to disciple our children, to leave a legacy to our children. And these things right now are very much at risk.
When we say the right must win, that's what we're talking about. That right there. We need to win the ability to continue to live peaceful and quiet lives where we can build families, build churches, spread the gospel.
Yeah. And as really America becomes more and more what people would call post-Christian, that's going to be a more difficult fight.
It is.
But we also need to seek the freedom to be able to engage in that fight. And that's going to require more people to be vocal, because I think the wrong assumption that so many people have is that, well, the majority of the people around me are Christians. That's not true. There's actually a very small percentage of the people in our country are actual regenerate Christians who have the power of the Holy Spirit in their lives. And so I think we overestimate our numbers because so many identify culturally as evangelicals. But what we're actually seeing from the lack of Christian witness and influence in our nation is that many of those people that are claiming to be evangelicals are not at all.
Yeah. And so this shouldn't be surprising to us. In an increasingly secularizing country that we are post-Christian, we say that in our podcast, we should expect to see, and it's not a good thing, less Christian influence across the political spectrum. So on the left, that manifests itself as demonic chaos, and we've talked about that. But on the right, we are seeing an increase in Christless conservatism.
Absolutely.
And we've seen that recently. There's going to be less of a commitment to ending abortion. There's going to be compromise tempted on LGBT issues. We see it in other vices that are accepted, like the pot that's everywhere and gambling. Like, these aren't good things. And we're not saying that those things increasing in acceptability on the right is good and that we should embrace those at all. We're not saying that. We're just saying we should expect that's going to happen in a secularizing culture, and we need to add our Christian influence to opposing those immoral things.
And I think one question that might kind of obviously come up for some people is because, and is said a lot over the past couple of weeks, is that the Republican Party platform, and whether or not you want to admit it in the United States, the right is so often identified as Republican in our nation. Sure. It isn't wholly a great identifier. There's so many liberal Republicans that have had an impact, but Christless conservatism is still conservatism, but it's going to be a conservative light. And what's happened in recent days in the Republican Party from the platform perspective is it's true that they have taken the fight for life out of the platform during this election cycle. They have taken the issue of gay marriage out of the party platform during this cycle. But what's fascinating to me, I just want to speak to this for a moment, is that what I've heard from a lot of people that have avoided political discourse in the past days, as soon as that happened, they engaged, because the only time that so many, and this is especially true of pastors, because when they see the Republican Party make a misstep where conservatism is concerned, they see that as an opportunity to separate themselves because they think it's going to give them a witness to the left, not because they think that they can instill some type of conservative values. In the past couple of weeks, I've seen people that have not mentioned abortion in the past decade start clutching their pearls and virtue signaling as though they've been involved in the fight for life so vigorously and aggressively for the past decade, and they can't believe that they would take that out of the platform. And to you, it's just like, hey, why don't you just sit this one out and let the guys that have actually been advocating for life, because you're nothing more than a fool who's virtue signaling, so just shut up. What actually happened where the abortion issue is concerned, and here's the deal, I do not think they should have taken it out of the platform. I want to be completely honest. It does need to be at the forefront of the conservative fight for the right. But what happened is because so many Christians tried to play this winsome Tim Keller foolishness third way game, that they allowed Christless conservatives to get into the Republican Party and to get into the leadership, because so many Christians just said, well, we don't want to be involved. We're going to be Switzerland. When you do that, you're going to face the repercussion. And the repercussion is that during the first Trump administration, when he righteously did what he said he was going to do, and he put Supreme Court justices on the court that did reverse Roe versus Wade. And I'll be the first to say, the person that's responsible for reversing Roe versus Wade is Donald Trump. If you will not admit that, then you are lying, and you need to repent of your lies. Donald Trump put the justices on the court to reverse Roe versus Wade. And so during this election cycle, when the Republican Party gathered, what they did was they said, we won. They don't understand what the fight for life is because Christians stopped influencing them. And so they looked at reversing Roe versus Wade and they said, hey, we won. And so what they did put as a minor platform statement that's not on the major points of the platform is they put that abortion is now being fought at the state level because they believe that that is sufficient to win the fight for life. They're throwing a celebration party. They believe that they have won. And for the people that took a backseat where politics is concerned, that said, we're not culture warriors, Jesus is neither a Democrat nor is he Republican, to now all of a sudden come out and pretend that they've been this virtuous warrior for so long, and how can you say you're a Republican when the Republicans aren't even pro-life anymore? That's a lie. Conservatism will always be pro-life. But I can tell you what the Republican Party didn't do. Make codifying Roe versus Wade as the law of the land part of their platform, which the left has done, which the left has said. And if you don't think Kamala Harris is going to seek taxpayer-funded abortions, then you simply don't know what time it is, and you are an ignorant rube that has no business leading a church. they're going to do that. So the right must win, even without it in the party platform. The right is still fighting the cause for life. But we have to fight Christless conservatism, or it will get worse.
Yeah. Our options when we see Christless conservatism on the rise, which it will be in a secularizing culture,
Absolutely.
we can either disengage and just lose all our influence, or we can seek to evangelize the right, which is what we need to be doing, and make them more Christian. That does not mean that we don't want to evangelize the left. We just read a verse in Timothy. We want to evangelize all people. The gospel goes out to all people. But on the right, we do have a group. While they don't share our Christian morality and our Christian worldview, we do have common cause with them.
That's right.
With stopping civilizational collapse. And they have told us we have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
They've said that. We need to take that seat at the table to show them, well, this is where Christian morality and a Christian worldview has answers to a lot of the questions that you're asking.
And I said it in the article, and I've heard other people say it as well, but it's going to be pretty hard to fight for abortion to be illegal in the United States if there is no longer a United States.
Yeah.
And when you look at the economic issues, when you look at the illegal immigration issue, when you look at the price of gas, when you look at the fact that insurance has gone up over 160% under the Biden administration, you are looking at moral issues, whether you want to admit it or not. This is the deconstruction of the United States. This is a Cold War on your home, propagated specifically by players from the left. And so it's time for us to stand up and actually get involved.
We need to be realistic. The Republican Party has never been Christian. All right, that is a naive idea that something has changed recently. They are becoming more secular. They've never been Christian. The leadership of the Republican Party has always been secular. There used to be more Christian influence in our culture, and so that would spread into the parties. But much of what happened before was we were being bargained with as a Christian coalition, and that's how politics works. And that wasn't a bad thing. And now our bargaining chips are down a little bit because we have failed to have influence. And so the answer is
and let's just be honest, we don't have influence because of Tim Keller. We don't have influence because of Andy Stanley. We don't have influence because of J.D. Greear. We don't have influence because of Ed Litton. We don't have influence because of so many that wanted to spend the last 15 years dog whistling the leftists that they're the nicest guys in the room and they would never say anything to offend them.
And that they're not on a side. If
Absolutely.
you're not on someone's side, why do you expect to have influence with them? So we need to get on a side.
We have to. It's the only way to save the nation.
Let's talk about some objections that people may have, because I think that'll be a helpful conversation. One objection that I've heard a lot is, how will the left hear the gospel if we're just hostile to them, even in our services?
I think that's actually a strategy for them to hear the gospel. And of course, on so many of the days that I preach, I get so many questions from people that have only been here once or twice, because I do preach differently than any. It's not just a devotional hour with me. It's like I'm actually trying to help you change your life, actually trying to help you have a vision for how you can change the world around you. But the hostility towards the left is a strategy for reaching the left. As I said earlier, it means our current vision for evangelizing the left, I think, is wrong. Our current strategy is, if the most wicked people in our society just think that we're really nice and they would enjoy having dinner with us, then that's going to bring them to faith in Jesus Christ. I do think that is something. Hospitality is vital in this, but it's a hospitality where all of our cards are on the table and we are honest that there is something wrong with you, and the only answer to what is wrong with you is Jesus Christ. And the left-leaning ideology that's going on in so many people's lives is actually what they need to be saved from. It's not just a separate issue altogether. It's part of why you need redemption. And so we reach them by telling them, the wrath of God has appeared, and it's against all of mankind. Therefore, he has declared now is the time to repent and come to Jesus Christ.
Another thing I've heard is, when you say something as strong as we need to defeat the left, not everyone on the political left means us harm. Some don't understand what they're involved in. It's just the extremists that you're talking about. How would you respond to that?
I would say that the center has been hollowed out.
Yeah.
You cannot look at the culture right now and say that there is someone that really is on the left that's not seeking your family harm. Now, there are some people that don't realize what's going on the left, and that's where conversations happen. And I think a lot of this is that they're afraid that they're not just going to understand immediately that we're the nicest guys in the room. Now, you got to be willing to engage people and actually tell them what's happening. Actually talk to your neighbors about what's going on in the world. Actually start dialogues with other people so that it can be exposed. I mean, Ephesians 5:11-15 has the vision for we exist to shine light on very dark places, but we do not get involved in the dark places. We expose them. And so when we naively say that there's good people on the left that don't do us harm, it's hurting people even if they don't realize what's going on. It's the only thing that we can do is be honest with them about the harm.
Yeah, I just think that notion that there's this kind of large group of people on the left that don't really understand what they're involved in, I don't think it's a large group. And for the ones that may be true of, they're still hurting people.
Mm-hmm.
And they still need to be woken up. So it doesn't really change the reality of what needs to happen. They're still headed towards destruction.
Yeah, and the reality is the most dangerous people in our nation are blue-haired soccer moms.
Yeah.
They're the most dangerous people in our nation. They want to trans your children. And
not innocent.
They're not innocent people. They know exactly what they're doing. They're not steeped in economic theory. They're not on the left because they have a vision for taxation. They're not on the left because they understand how economics works. They're on the left because they have a chemical imbalance and they want to trans, not just their children. They want to make sure that the children of Christians are trans.
Many of them love abortion.
Oh, absolutely.
That's not innocent.
I think we also live in an age where Christian podcasts have gotten a little bit ridiculous, and we're looking for what demons are doing in the hills of Nevada, and we think it's a fairy called Bigfoot. That's not spiritual warfare. What is spiritual warfare is the demonic influence that's going on with soccer moms in our nation, and the fact that they literally want to put all kids on puberty blockers, and they literally want to have gender reassignment surgery for all of the kids. That's what you're praying against. That's what you're fighting against, and that's what you've got to be willing to engage if you're going to put yourself in that arena.
That's what you got to be willing to offend, too. All right, another question. Kind of answered this already, but we're whitewashing the moral degeneracy of Republicans when we support the right. How would you respond to that?
I would say that the only way to not whitewash their moral degeneracy is to stop being silent and actually get involved. And if our voice is not heard, that's what's going to keep happening, is Christless conservatism is going to keep winning. And yeah, there are Pharisees in the Republican Party. But let's be the opposite of that then. That's the answer. And so what I've actually seen in the last few weeks has been horrendous malpractice. As I've seen pastors look at that issue and say, well, the way that you do that is you find your peace in Jesus, you bury your head in the sand, and you tell the world the lie that Jesus is neither a Democrat or a Republican. Now, that's not going to help anybody. What's going to help is if you proclaim the truth and you actually get involved in society and in the culture around you, and you seek to make the right win, because the right must win.
Thought of one other objection that people might have that I think would be helpful to talk about. Does all of this mean that we make our Sunday mornings a political rally now?
No, it doesn't. Ours isn't. Are there going to be implications on politics almost every week? Absolutely. But what's happened to preaching, and this is especially true in the Reformed camp, a faulty view of expository preaching has been put forward where it's now, I think, mostly referred to as gospel-centered expository preaching, where to make any application for what actually has to change in your life or what you actually must do when you walk away is somehow seen as anti-gospel. And that's because even in the Reformed camp, there are so many antinomians. And what antinomianism is, it's this idea that the law of God is somehow against the gospel of God. It's not. The law of God is what leads you to the gospel. And what gospel transformation actually means is now you have a different relationship with the law. There's nothing unrighteous in the law, according to the Apostle Paul, but the law of Christ actually puts you in a place where the law cannot and never will be able to condemn you. And so the reason I say there's going to be political applications every week that are just necessarily going to come is because expository preaching exposes even the darkness in my life, the darkness in your life, the darkness in the culture around us. And so when you walk out of here on a Sunday morning, you should walk out with a different type of life and a different way of exposing the darkness. But what I think is more dangerous is the idea that politics has no place in the pulpit. And that's not true. So if you go week after week after week after week, and the pastor does not make any political reference, he doesn't make any political application ever, that's what's actually more dangerous, because Christ is sovereign over the political sphere. And if Christ is sovereign over the political sphere, then his lordship has to be dealt with in the political sphere. And we have to deal with those issues.
Everything is spiritual. You said that Sunday. We've been saying that our whole ministry. It's so true. And a lot of pastors right now are setting themselves up to be ignored by the next generation because they won't take the truths of scriptures and apply them to real life. And real life is political. It's one of my big takeaways, I think.
Yeah, one critic who really did not like my sermon 2 weeks ago, he begged the question. He was like, well, did you preach politics or did you preach Christ? And the only response is yes, because Christ is Lord over politics.
Last thought I got. We're not going to do that perfectly.
No.
But being a man and being a pastor means you have the courage to live and speak to the time that God has put you in, and we are going to do that.
Mm-hmm. And there are times where I'm not going to do it perfectly, and I know that. But part of me being a man is the fact that, guess what? I have the courage to actually give it a shot. I've got the courage to actually do it. And, you know, Theodore Roosevelt famously said, it's not the critic who counts. If you got a better vision, get in the game. But you don't have a better vision. We've got to save the nation, and Christ is the key to saving the nation, just like he's the key to saving every human life in the nation. And so we've got to repent of our sin. We've got to turn to Christ. We've got to trust Christ, and we've got to engage the darkness. And when we do that, I think we're left with the vision: the right must win. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Converge podcast. Do us a favor, give us another one of those great, honest 5-star reviews. Leave a little note about how helpful this podcast is for you on whatever platform you happen to be listening in. Have a great day, and the right must win.